This session today is going to be on fraud detection on AWS. So just a little before we begin about myself, just to really calibrate for any of the questions or conversations that we might have during or after this presentation. So I'm a senior developer advocate here at AWS, and just in case you're not familiar with that term, senior developer advocate, essentially it's just an engineer who helps build awareness and adoption. I've worked on a lot of different developer-focused verticals in the past. If you have any questions on any of those, feel free to reach out or at Twitter at Canal732 or email me, kbotcher@amazon.com. By far, the fastest way to get in touch with me is on Twitter. And just personally, I am really into machine learning and computer vision. We'll talk a little bit about that ML component in this presentation. On the left over there, you can see a little app model I made that tells you whether the garage door is open or closed. On the right, another one that counts how many people are in line at the Shake Shack in Madison Square Park, where I live. And then another fun one, an object detection model just for some common household items. So this is a passion of mine. So if any questions on any of those, feel free to reach out. Today we're going to be talking about one of our machine learning services called Fraud Detector. But before we go into there, I want to just kind of level set for everyone in the audience on how we think of machine learning here at AWS. And we look at it in terms of this stack, right? You have these three layers over here. So if you start at the bottom, this is our machine learning frameworks and infrastructure. This is essentially for those advanced data practitioners, machine learning practitioners, and data scientists, for people who are really comfortable at that framework level. So we have teams dedicated here at AWS for these different frameworks, TensorFlow, PyTorch, MXNet, to really make sure that they run in the most optimized way possible on our cloud. Now, if you move one level above that, the machine learning services, this is our suite of tools under that SageMaker umbrella that make it easy to build, train, and deploy machine learning models. And one level above those, the AI services, these are services where we have trained those machine learning models internally here at AWS and taken the learnings that we've had at AWS or Amazon.com, and we've opened that up as APIs for any developer, doesn't matter what level of machine learning expertise they have, to incorporate into their applications. And now we've divided that up into different categories over here. You can see this vision, speech, and then all the way to the right over there is a new category for fraud detection, right? So this is taking advantage of those learnings from the past 20 plus years that we've had with Amazon.com plus AWS to help our customers mitigate fraud and help detect fraud quicker. And unfortunately, fraudsters are everywhere, and there is a serious financial aspect to this problem, right? So it's projected by 2023 that the losses from online fraud, the payment fraud, will tally up to close to $36 billion, and these are big numbers here, and this is a big problem. It's one of the reasons why a lot of our customers come to us and ask us if we can open up some of the insights that we have through Amazon.com and through AWS to our customers. And so fraud, unfortunately, also is everywhere, right? So we see it in lending and insurance, counterfeit personal details, identity theft, fake bank accounts, false claims, inflated claims, false documents for insurance. And there are a couple of different ways to combat this here at AWS. You have purely rule-based methods to combat fraud. So essentially, you can say that if someone is coming from a certain IP address and they're coming from a certain domain, but they're saying their location is different from where their IP address is showcasing they're coming from. You can take advantage of certain rule-based rules, like in this case, and just specifically say if that specific instance happens, block that traffic. Now, you can also do machine learning where it's not about those specifics, it's more about the patterns that you see. And if something is in that pattern of behavior, then take some action if it looks like it's fraud. Now, in machine learning, there's lots of different algorithms that we have here at AWS to let you do this, right? So you have the ability to do supervised or unsupervised learning. And essentially what that means is for supervised learning, you're you're creating a model with a lot of data, and you're labeling each row of that data as this is fraudulent, this is a legitimate transaction, this is a fraudulent transaction, legitimate, and so forth. Now, unsupervised is where you're not labeling anything. You're letting all the transactions and events happen, and then you're taking a look at the similarities of each of those events, and you're doing things like clustering. And if something is not part of that cluster, it's potential fraud, right? You can also take advantage of graph neural networks and see the relationships between objects to help detect fraud. And then a service that we've opened up here that I spoke about is the Fraud Detector, right? So this is another method where you don't need to have that machine learning expertise to go ahead and create a model that takes advantage of AWS and Amazon's learnings plus your own data to create a really powerful fraud detection tool. And we'll go in more into that in a second. So again, fraud comes in all shapes and forms. Some of the examples you see here are what we really see here at AWS and Amazon.com. You see different types of payment fraud, account takeovers and compromises, and free tier abuse, premium phone number abuse. One of the most common things that we see at AWS is that post-pay account service fraud. And essentially what that means is you sign up for an account, you give us some form of payment, and you start using the service. And now you typically use those services first, and then at the end of the month, we charge you for what you've used. And so this typically means that we can't do an authorization or hold on that card, and we see a lot of abuse internally throughout the years from this, where people try to use prepaid cards, and there's not enough funds on those cards, or other mechanisms to try to game the system, take advantage of services without having to pay for it, right? So we built up a lot of learnings and knowledge around these forms of abuse. And with Fraud Detector, we'll open that up to everyone. So just to dive deeper, we spoke about business rules versus machine learning. I just want to just give another example here. You can see it says if, excuse me, if IP address location is Japan and customer address country is Japan, but customer phone location is Spain, then take it out of that typical workflow and investigate, is this an actual transaction, is it not? The issue with these rules, again, is that bad actors can easily start getting around these rules, and then you're going to have to create new rules to keep trying to meet the bad actors and prevent them from taking these abusive actions. Now, again, with machine learning, you don't have to do this. You can start looking at the patterns, and this makes it much more powerful and less brittle than just purely rule-based fraud detection. So some other aspects of fraud detection is, again, you lose lots of money with fraud each year. Online businesses are prone to fraud attacks. Again, bad actors can often change tactics. And this aspect of creating more and more rules to keep matching with those bad actors, this gets very intensive after a while. And it's also, most of the fraud teams that we talk with, they don't have any engineers on their teams to help modify the rules inside of their systems as fast as they could, right? So there is a lot of issues that make fraud detection pretty difficult. Now, let's say you do also want to go ahead and use machine learning, so you're not using those rule-based methods for fraud detection. Machine learning data scientists with the ML expertise are hard to find, and they don't come cheap. We also talk with a lot of customers who try this one-size-fits-all model usage, so they get this general data set, and they just try to create a model with that and apply that to their own data. But the accuracy tends to be really low because this doesn't represent their business. A lot of times that they're going to need to supplement this data set with their own, and then that alone also takes more engineering effort to create that data set and also make sure that these features are right for machine learning. And then one of the biggest issues when creating your own machine learning model for fraud detection is class imbalance, right? So if you're not a machine learning expertise, you want to make sure that when you're training your model, you have equal parts fraud and not fraud in your data set, so your model can tell the difference between what's legitimate and what's not. And for most use cases, while fraud is a huge problem, it is not a massive problem that equals the number of legitimate actions, right? So it's hard to train a machine learning model with your own data sets to counteract and mitigate fraud. So these are some of the reasons why we built Fraud Detector here at AWS. And this is just a service that makes it, it takes advantage of machine learning to detect online fraud in real time and at scale. It enables you to build high quality fraud detection models using templates. And it doesn't require you to use any machine learning and have any machine learning expertise. With this, you can start shifting left and prevent bad actors from entering your system sooner. And then again, it comes with built-in fraud expertise from Amazon.com and AWS. It also gives fraud teams more control because once you add fraud detector in a system, you don't need to keep using engineering resources to keep adding more code or to keep modifying your systems for the fraud detector. And we'll go into how that works in a bit as well. So it detects common types of online fraud, right? So new account fraud, guest checkout fraud, that try before you buy that I was speaking about earlier as well. And then it will come with online payment fraud coming soon. So the way this works is first you have to upload your training data set to Amazon S3, right? And your training data set is essentially going to be this large CSV file, and we require that to have at least 10,000 rows, essentially, which are just events. And then 500 of those events need to be fraudulent, and then at a minimum, right? So at a minimum, you need 10,000 events, and 500 of those have to be fraudulent. And then from there, we can create a high quality model for you to detect fraud. And then so once you upload that data set into S3, then from there, the service Fraud Detector will go ahead and inspect that data. It'll then start enriching that data. And this is a really interesting and important step here. When it enriches that data, it takes a look at things like the IP address that a customer might be using to register an account. And from there, it'll go ahead and start adding information like the city, the country, the latitude and longitude, the ISP, the domain. If there are transactions happening and you have credit card BIN numbers, which I believe are the first 6 numbers of a credit card, from there, it'll go ahead and look up different aspects of the bank and other geocode information. So you can see what type of network that is, like, for example, Visa, the type of card, debit, credit, the particular bank, the bank location, and more. So that enrichment aspect of it is another really important aspect of Fraud Detector. Once it starts enriching that data, then it starts doing a lot of those other machine learning aspects of that workflow, like feature engineering, making sure it's selecting the right features for that machine learning model. It starts looking at multiple different types of machine learning algorithms that make sense for this, right? And then from there, it starts training not just one model, multiple models, and then it starts competing and seeing which of those models gives the highest accuracy. And then it starts doing hyperparameter optimization after that, which is another aspect of machine learning. And then from there, finally, it hosts that model for you. So a lot of that complexity that comes with building, training, and deploying that machine learning model is all done in the background for you. And all you need to do is upload that CSV file of events, and then you just have to label it as, is this legitimate or is this fraudulent? And that's it. And we'll showcase that. All right, so this is just an example of how this can work. You have a customer who wants to make a checkout. Your website will see the IP address, the email, the payment information. From there, once your website sees that, it'll go ahead and send that to Fraud Detector. And then Fraud Detector will return back a score, right? And these scores are going to be between 0 and to 1,000. So usually the higher that number is, the more likely that's fraud. The lower the number is, the more likely that is not fraud. And then from there, you get to choose what rules you want to do based on that, right? You can say that if it's between this threshold, make it so that it puts it into a separate review process. If it's this threshold, right away approve it. If not, go reject it. You get to set what labels you want to return back to your application, and your application can go decide what it wants to do when it sees a certain label, right? And your fraud team can just focus in on what it does best. So again, some of the key features here, Fraud Detector has pre-built detection model templates. And when we're talking about templates, we're talking about essentially different aspects of fraud that we've seen here at AWS and Amazon.com. And then from there, you get to build on top of that. If you are familiar with machine learning, this is a process called transfer learning, where we already have those previous machine learning models that detect fraud and legitimate actions. And then from there, we use your data to make that better. It also gives you the ability for that, the automatic creation of those detection models, like we spoke about before. A lot of that heavy lifting is automatically done for you. Again, it learns from past attempts that we've seen here at Fraud at Amazon.com. It also has integration with SageMaker, right? So again, if you remember when I was talking about those different layers of AI and ML we have here at AWS, SageMaker was that middle layer. And it just makes it really easy to build, train, and deploy machine learning models. So in your organization, if you already have models to detect fraud, you don't have to have your engineers do anything else. Your fraud team can go ahead and integrate with those models as well and add that into the application. Fraud Detector also gives you a console where you can see past events and any sort of detection logic that you've have for those events as well. So again, just to showcase again, we typically recommend, the way this works, you upload your training data set into S3. We typically recommend 3 to 6 months worth of data to really create a good model over here. First thing we do again is look at that data and make sure that you have the correct, the right amount of inputs in that data. So we require, I believe, at least 2 features, right? So it doesn't matter what those features are, IP address, user agent, location, some require those 2 features plus a timestamp as well as a label that says whether this is legitimate or not legitimate, right? So that data validation step checks for that. Next thing, again, we go into that enrichment process where we start adding a lot of information to that information you sent us just to make this a more robust data set. From there, we go ahead and choose the features and convert that into the format that our model likes to really get an accurate result. Then we start training multiple pipelines of models with different types of algorithms, and we compare the accuracy of each of those, and we then return the highest accuracy model. From there, we showcase metrics so you can see how well that model does, and then we automatically deploy and host that for you. Again, this is all done for you in the background. This process, depending on how much data you give us, usually takes around 45 minutes, I would say, on average, that I've seen playing around with the system to create that model for you in the background. And I just want to showcase a little example of this as well. So I think everyone here can see my screen. So we're at the AWS console right now. Actually, let me start from the beginning. So let's go to the AWS console. This is how you access your AWS services. Now, Fraud Detector, if you scroll down over here, it's in this machine learning section over here, Fraud Detector. But I always find it easier just to search for the service, right? So let's just go ahead and search for Fraud Detector. And then you get the Fraud Detector page over here. Now, the way this works, you have to create 3 things. The first thing you need to create is the event. What is the event that you want to assess for fraud? After you create the event and give the details of what that event looks like, then you create a model to learn on how to assess for fraud for those events. So let's just showcase this. Let's go ahead and create an event. We can call this, let's say this is for website registrations. So we can call this right now AngelBeat registrations, detecting fraud for AngelBeat. And the next thing over here, it asks for an entity. Select the entity for this event. So who's making these events, right? And this is just a name over here that we assess. So we can just say customer, create entity, and now we have this entity called customer. What variables, what features of this data do we want to look at, right? So we can say, I just look at the features that we have in our data set. And let me show you an example of a data set over here. So let me just scroll this onto a screen. So this is a CSV file of 20,000 rows, right? So this is just transactions. These are synthetic data, fake data that I generated. But essentially, this is just the IP address, email, billing, user agent, phone number, billing address, and then a label over here that says legitimate or fraud, right? So the features are these features here: IP address, email address, user agent, etc. I've already uploaded this to S3, and it's going to ask over here, first, what's the IAM role to give it access to that data. So I'm just going to say this is the role. And again, by default here at AWS, there is no access to anything. You have to, by default, you have to give it access to each part of the system, right? So by default, Fraud Detector does not have access to your data. You have to provide that. So for S3, and then we just say where I put that data. So I put it in this bucket, and then I have this it's called registration data 20k full.csv. So this is the file. I think I might have spelled that incorrectly, but anyways, this is how it works. So basically, you'll take a look at that data, and then from there, you just say fraud or legit, and then you go ahead and create an event. Once you create that event, the next step would be to go ahead and just create a model. And then from here, you just say create a model, and you just follow this process. It's really simple. So we can just say Angel Beats fraud detection. And then we say we only have the template like I spoke about before. Right now, we only have online fraud insights. We'll have more templates coming out after this as well. And then from here, we can just say an event like the event I just showcased, registration. And then we just give that historical data. Like I mentioned before during the presentation, we require 10,000 records right now. 500 of that has to be fraud. Once we do that, we go ahead and just train the model. Again, like I mentioned before, that model takes around 45 minutes to train. But however, just like a good cooking show here, I already have a pre-made one done. So we go ahead and take a look at a model. And take a look at this model, and now we'll see the visualizations that I was talking about before, right? So when you get that model, it'll return back a score from a 0 to 1,000, right? In this case over here, you can see that the closer it gets to 1,000, that means the more likely it is it's very positive that's fraud. And the closer it gets to 0, the more likely that is it's very positive it's a legitimate transaction. And so that's how the fraud detector works. And then basically, you just have to create, the model by itself is great, but now you need to have some logic behind it. What do you want to do for your system? And so that third thing is creating a detector. So there's three things again: creating an event, creating a model, and then what do you do with that model? That's the detector, right? The detector just is really simply, it just says what rules do you want to do with those scores. If you get, so in this case, we have some sample rules here. If you see something's greater than 900, return back this label, high fraud risk. If it's less than or equal to 700, low fraud risk. Between 7 to 900, medium fraud risk, right? And this is just a sample one I just made. You can modify that accordingly to your system as well. And then based on that, you can take certain actions. So that is how that works. Let me just see if I can show you something really quick here. Yep. Okay, so that is Fraud Detector. And then one other thing I want to showcase here is, let's just test this out, right? So we have this this model over here, and we have this data. And we said that, for example, in this case, we have this fake data billing address, this state, this IP address, this user agent, and we run a test on it. It'll say that the score is 27. So in this case, the label is approved. And now in your system, you can set that if someone's approved, automatically do the transaction. We have some more data over here. Another example from this model that I trained on, that when it runs through this, it gets a score of 984. And the outcome now is a verified customer. Now, when you're internally in your application, your logic, you can say if it sees verified customer, maybe have someone call them, or but don't let that transaction go through, whatever the process you want to do for that is. So this is essentially Fraud Detector. Let me quickly go back to my presentation here. I see that time is coming up here, but one of the things I wanted to mention over here as well is that data is very important, right? So the features that you want to add in Fraud Detector, this is really important. And this is something that's individual to every business, whether that's IP address, whether that's the registration time, the age of the account. These are things to take into consideration when creating that data set. Like, for example, we see that new accounts with ages less than 2 days, are much more likely to cause fraud than accounts that are a little bit more mature. So those pieces of information are really important to add to your data sets as well. And we have some pretty good blog posts if you search for Fraud Detector, kind of talking you through that as well. I know there's 3 minutes left. Let's just go to questions as well.
All right, let me check some of the questions here. I think that's fantastic. Do you also want to make some summary content comments, Keneal?
Yeah, so essentially, Fraud Detector is our AI service that opens up a lot of the learnings that we've had here at AWS and Amazon.com to everyone. All you really need to do is have that CSV file of training data, upload that to us, and we essentially take care of all of that heavy lifting. And then from there, it's easy for your fraud teams to have a model and automatically build some logic behind that to mitigate fraud.